You're listening to the Bold Apologia podcast. Here you can expect to find real conversation and dialogue centralized around the purpose for sharing the hope of Jesus Christ in light of theology, apologetics, and culture. We hope and believe this episode will add confidence to your faith by equipping you with boldness to share the good news of the gospel. And now, your host, Adam Parker.
Hello there, Bold Apologia podcast listeners. I'm Adam Parker. I am the host of this podcast, and I really look forward to getting into the topic that we're going to be jumping into today. This is kind of a tag on to my most recent podcast that I did specifically on the Cosmological argument. This podcast is actually going to be on Leibniz's cosmological argument. And before I get into that, I just want to share the reason why I'm doing some of these little episodes here and there. I just want to get some information out just about some of these kind of different arguments that really are there for really theism in particular, but in the grand scheme of it all, Christianity. And so that's why I'm doing this. You will see more arguments like this that I'll be sharing, and I will also get into some specific arguments for Christianity in particular, but I'm just throwing some things out there just to get things out so people have something they can listen to, and I really believe that this is going to be a helpful addition to the podcast. I do have some things coming down the pike as far as guests go, and I'm really excited about a panel that I will be having in September going over the different kinds of apologetics, which will have some different people representing those kinds. So, for example, I'll have Donald Williams, who we've had on this podcast many times before. He will represent the cumulative approach. There's also Daniel McAdams, who's a great guy, good friend of mine. He's going to cover the evidential approach to apologetics. He's actually been on the podcast. He and I did a podcast together on the biblical explanation for the paranormal. And then we're going to have Andrew Rappaport covering presuppositional apologetics. And then we have someone who will be covering the topic of classical apologetics and just going through these things and creating a discussion where each one of these individuals are able to really, frankly, challenge each other in a godly way and in such a way that we can have a productive conversation, which I'm very excited for. Now, let's get into this particular podcast. Now, after posting my most recent podcast, which was on the cosmological argument, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and his name is David Leva. So, David, I'd just like to do a shout out to you. I appreciate you, man. He's a good friend of mine. He and I run some online forums together, and I really appreciate him, who he is. He's always been a great friend to me, and he provided some constructive feedback. In fact, he kind of suggested that I really should have expounded more on the subject matter of the cosmological argument. He actually felt that the content was a bit too technical or textbookish, which is kind of funny because he's a lawyer, and knowing that he's a lawyer, I was kind of surprised because lawyers typically deal with complex and detailed information. So I would have thought that this was something that was right up his alley. But to my surprise, he wanted some more interaction and personal commentary. And in fact, given the structured nature of my podcast that I did, I was really almost sure that he would enjoy it, but really he gave this constructive feedback, which I appreciate, and he appreciated the podcast. It's just he pointed out correctly that I should have explained a few things more in depth. For instance, he mentioned that I should have delved deeper into the problem with paradoxes, and my response was simple. I was like, well, if I give my listeners all the information, they won't have any reason to dig deeper. And so that was my little quip back, and I think that he got my point with that. I don't want to spoon feed everything, but at the same time, I do want to specifically address the issue of paradoxes because they're actually going to be crucial for this podcast as well, because it's going to give me an opportunity to segue into the subject matter for this podcast. And if you listen to my most recent podcast on the Kalam cosmological argument, you learned that the argument is based on the premise that the universe had a beginning, and since it had a beginning, it must have a cause. And at the end of the podcast, I concluded that if the universe had a cause, that cause must be God. And I went over the scriptural basis for that and the scriptural argument for that, which I thought was important. Now, to counter this argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, detractors claim that there could be, or that there is, what's called an infinite regress of past events. And this is a short way of implying that there is no need for a beginning of the universe because past events stretch back infinitely. So to address this claim, I discussed something called Hilbert's Hotel, and this is where our issue with paradoxes really comes in. So Hilbert's Hotel is a famous thought experiment that illustrates the counterintuitive properties of infinity. So here's a breakdown of the paradox and the problems that Hilbert's Hotel presents. So we got these scenarios, and if we were to take a look at it, we start with this idea of a new guest. So Hilbert's Hotel has infinite rooms, and if a new guest arrives, the hotel manager can move the guest, which would be in room 1 per se, to then room 2. The guest in room 2 could be moved to room 3, and so on, and this process continues indefinitely, which would free up room 1 for the new guest. So as a result, an infinite hotel that is full can still accommodate one more guest. So this allows for the possibility of continual regresses of events taking place. And then what takes place after that is that you can now have infinitely many new guests. If infinitely many guests arrive, the manager can move the guest in room N to room 2N, effectively doubling their number, and this will free up all the odd-numbered rooms, providing space for the infinitely many new guests that have showed up. Now, this brings us to point 3, because now you have to evacuate infinitely many rooms. So the hotel can accommodate infinitely many new guests by continuously relocating rooms, demonstrating that traditional notions of quote-unquote full don't really apply to this infinite hotel that we call Hilbert's Hotel. Now, there's problems and paradoxes with this. And in the same way, there would be problems and paradoxes with the idea of there being an infinite regress of past events going back further and further in the history of the universe, and that's problematic as well. So one, there's a counterintuitive nature to this idea of an infinite regress of events, or this idea of infinity, because that's really where it comes in, is that infinity presents problems. So the idea of a hotel that can be full yet still accommodate more guests really defies our intuitive understanding of occupancy and space. And so that's problematic. And so that's why Hilbert's Hotel presents paradoxes and reveals some issues with that concept of infinity. Then if we were to go to point 2, there's some mathematical implications with Hilbert's Hotel, because it demonstrates that rules governing finite sets don't apply to infinite sets in the same way. And so, for example, the set of natural numbers and the set of even numbers that I just talked about in point 2 are both infinite yet there is a one-to-one correspondence between them, showing that they're actually the same size despite our intuition that there should be fewer even numbers as a result. And if that doesn't make sense, please just bear with me. This is some really heady stuff. But then if we were to go to point 3, if we were to really take a look at infinity in real life, it really challenges our understanding of infinity in practical terms. Applying infinite set theory to real-world scenarios can lead to paradoxes that seem impossible or even nonsensical in finite terms, which then brings us to point 4. There's philosophical implications to this because it raises questions about the nature of infinity and the actual existence of infinite entities. Can an infinite hotel exist in reality, or is it purely a mathematical abstraction? This really touches on deep philosophical debates about the nature of infinity, and it limits human understanding. And so my conclusion to this on Hilbert's Hotel is that it highlights the peculiar and paradoxical properties of infinity, challenging our finite intuitions and demonstrating the unique rules that govern infinite sets. And really, it serves as a thought-provoking tool in mathematics and philosophy, illustrating the need really for careful consideration when dealing with the concept of infinity. And so consequently, I argue that the notion of an infinite regress of past events is problematic because it ignores, really, if we were to look at it scientifically, what we know about entropy. Because entropy says that everything wears down over time. Now, if there's an infinite regress of events, this is problematic because if events go back infinitely, because this is an infinite regress, that infinity would max out entropy, because entropy is the argument or the scientific proof, really, that energy runs out. And so there should be no energy right now. It essentially makes the existence of the universe as we know it impossible, because infinity would have that sort of effect on entropy. It would really actually magnify the entropy to a point where life on Earth, life in this universe, would just be impossible as we know it. So the Kalam cosmological argument is significant in the realm of Christian apologetics and philosophical theology, as it underscores the necessity of a beginning to the universe, leading to the conclusion that this beginning must have a cause, which we identify as God. Okay, so this brings me to really the topic for this podcast. So for this podcast, I'd like to build really on the Kalam cosmological argument by bringing you to consider also Leibniz's cosmological argument, which provides a complementary perspective to Kalam. The Leibniz cosmological argument is named after the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And he was born in 1646 and he died in 1716. Leibniz was a prominent figure in the Age of Enlightenment, and he was known for his contributions to metaphysics, logic, and the development of calculus independently of Isaac Newton. So that's kind of a big deal. He's a very brilliant man. And so Leibniz, he formulated his cosmological argument based on the principle of what we call sufficient reason, which he posited as a foundational principle of rational inquiry. And so he says that this principle is important in that it asserts that everything that exists must have a reason or a cause for its existence. So that kind of makes sense, right? That it seems pretty simple. Leibniz, he was really concerned with addressing the ultimate question of why there is something rather than nothing. So if there was once nothing, what is the something that caused something to come out of nothing? And so in his work, Leibniz sought to demonstrate that the existence of the universe requires an explanation beyond the mere existence of contingent beings, which are like beings that depend on something else for their existence. I'm a contingent being. You are a contingent being. You rely on something else for your existence. If you didn't have the two parents that you had who got together, got married, or copulated in some way, you would not exist. So you are a contingent being. Now, he argued that the chain of contingent causes cannot extend infinitely and must ultimately lead to what is called a necessary being, one whose existence is not dependent on anything else and which contains within itself the reason for its existence. This necessary being, Leibniz concluded, is what we understand as God. Another way of putting this is that God exists by the necessity of his own nature. And so he's a necessary being. So there's contingent beings, that's you and me, and then there is God. He is a necessary being, or really the necessary being. And so Leibniz's argument aimed to provide a rational basis for belief in God by appealing to the necessity of a sufficient reason for the existence of the universe. And so his work significantly influenced subsequent philosophical and theological discussions and offered really a rigorous metaphysical framework that really supports the concept of a transcendent cause of the universe. Really, in short, really supports the concept of the existence of God. And so what's really important when it comes to Leibniz's argument is that it was heavily influenced by Aristotle, because this idea of a necessary being is not new. When Leibniz developed his approach, he was heavily influenced by some of Aristotle's writing, particularly Aristotle's concept of an unmoved mover. So Aristotle posited that all motion and change in the universe must ultimately be traced back to a primary cause that itself is not moved by anything else. And so this unmoved mover was seen as a necessary being existing independently and serving as the ultimate explanation for the existence and motion of all things. So Leibniz, he really piggybacked off of this and adopted and adapted this idea and framed it within his principle of sufficient reason to argue for a necessary being that explains the existence of the universe. Thus, as a result of all of this, Aristotle's influence is evident in Leibniz's cosmological argument, which seeks to really demonstrate the existence of God as the ultimate necessary being, as the ultimate unmoved mover who put into motion everything that we see. So really now it's important to just dig into this argument. So let's talk about that. Leibniz's argument, which we now also know as the principle of sufficient reason, or as I've been saying, Leibniz's cosmological argument, it posits that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. This leads to this question: why is there something rather than nothing? This is that big question that Leibniz wanted to find the answer to. And so Leibniz argues that the universe exists because it was brought into existence by something else. That's kind of a simple way of putting it. And this ultimate cause must be a necessary being, one that contains the reason for its existence within its own nature. That reason being, it exists because it must. This necessary being is what we call, and what Leibniz would call or understand to be God. And so Leibniz's argument can be summarized as follows. Let's take point 1, the principle of sufficient reason. Everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. 2, contingent and necessary beings. The universe is contingent, meaning it does not have to exist and could be different. So it needs to exist on the basis of a necessary being causing that to take place, which brings us to point 3. There's the necessity of a necessary being. There has to be a necessary being to bring something out of nothing. The explanation for the universe must ultimately reside in a necessary being that exists by the necessity of its own nature. That brings us to point 4. The only logical conclusion to this would be that that necessary being is God. Let's dig a little bit more into this principle of sufficient reason, which is a key component of Leibniz's cosmological argument. This principle is fundamental to understanding Leibniz's rationale and his argument for the existence of God. The principle of sufficient reason essentially states that everything that exists must have a reason or cause for its existence. And this idea can be broken down into a few points, really, but first let's consider the principle itself. When we say everything that exists has a reason for its existence, we mean that nothing can simply exist without an explanation. This explanation might be found within the nature of the thing itself. For example, I'm a human being. I exist because my parents obviously got together, they copulated, I was conceived, my mother gave birth to me, etc. And there is a line of contingent beings that took place before my parents and so forth back into the beginning when man was first created. And so this explanation might be found within the nature of the thing itself, for example, God, or it might be an external cause that brings it into existence, for example, through my parents' copulation and conception of me. I now exist after my mother gave birth to me. All these years later, here I am, right? I exist because of an external cause that brought me into existence. That's important to note. Here's another idea. For instance, take a look at an object like a book. The reason for the book's existence can be traced back to its author. You look at the printing press, you look at the materials used to produce it, it's all traced back to the author, etc. The existence of the book is contingent on these factors. It relies on them. Contingent beings therefore rely on someone or something for their existence. Leibniz extends this reasoning, though, to the entire universe. He argues that the universe, being a collection of contingent things like books or me or you, etc., cannot be the reason for its own existence. Instead, there must be an external cause that provides a sufficient reason for the existence of the universe. And this brings us to the distinction between contingent beings and necessary beings. So a contingent being, like I said, is something that could possibly not exist. Its existence is dependent on something else. Most things we encounter in our daily lives are contingent beings. They exist because of a series of causes and conditions. As I've laid out ad nauseum previously, I may even be considered rambling at this moment, but my hope is that by this time you are understanding what I'm saying. Now, on the other hand, a necessary being is something that must exist by the necessity of its own nature. Its existence is not dependent on anything else but itself. And so Leibniz argues that to find a sufficient reason for the existence of the contingent universe that we live in, we must ultimately arrive at the existence of a necessary being. And so why is this important? The principle of sufficient reason challenges us really to think beyond the immediate causes we see around us and to consider the ultimate cause of everything. For Leibniz, the ultimate cause is what we understand as God, a necessary being that provides the sufficient reason for the existence of the universe. Leibniz's use of the principle of sufficient reason aims to provide a rational foundation for belief in God, and by demonstrating that the universe cannot be self-explanatory and must rely on a necessary being for its existence, he seeks to show that belief in God is not just a matter of faith, but also a matter of logical necessity. Now, that's important. So, let me just summarize this quick. The principle of sufficient reason is a powerful philosophical tool that encourages us really to seek explanations for the existence of things, ultimately leading us to the conclusion of a necessary being, God, as the ultimate reason for the existence of the universe. All right, now that we have a good grasp on the principle of sufficient reason, let's walk through the argument step by step to see how it builds a case for the existence of God. So first, we have the principle of sufficient reason. We've established that the principle of sufficient reason asserts that everything that exists must have a reason for its existence. This principle really applies universally to all things, meaning that really nothing exists without a sufficient reason, either within itself or from an external cause. We've talked about that. That's important. Then we go to step 2. There's this existence of contingent beings. We've got to consider that the universe is composed of contingent beings that exist but do not have to exist. They exist because of certain conditions or causes. For example, a tree exists because a seed was planted and it had the necessary water, sunlight, and nutrients to grow. If those conditions were different, the tree actually might not exist. So it doesn't have to exist, but it does. It's a contingent being, or it's a contingent thing, really. Step 3. We go to this concept of the universe as a contingent entity. The entire universe, when viewed as a whole, is a vast collection of contingent beings. Just like the tree, the universe itself is contingent. We talked about the Big Bang Theory the last time I did this podcast, and it shows that the universe had a beginning. And so the universe does not have to exist. Its existence depends on a series of conditions and causes. This brings us to step 4. There's this search for a sufficient reason. We need to find a sufficient reason for all these contingent beings and these contingent things that exist in this contingent universe that we live in, right? So, given that the universe is contingent, we've got to find a reason for that. And according to the principle of sufficient reason, there must be an explanation for why the universe exists rather than not existing at all. So this explanation cannot be another contingent being, right? Because that would create an infinite series of contingent beings, and we've already gone over the issue with the idea of infinity. In fact, this is where the atheist often brings up this counter to the existence of God. Well, God created everything. He's the reason everything exists. And they'll say, well, who created God? Well, they misunderstand us. And really, Leibniz would say, you're misunderstanding me, because God is necessary. He exists by the necessity of his own nature. So, contingent beings require a reason for their existence, but necessary beings don't. That brings us to step 5, the necessity of a necessary being. So to find a sufficient reason for the existence of a contingent universe, we've got to posit the existence of a necessary being. A necessary being is something that must exist by its very nature. It doesn't depend on anything else for its existence, and this necessary being provides the ultimate explanation for the existence of the universe, and we know this as God. Which brings us to step 6. we identify the necessary being as God. And Leibniz argues that this necessary being, which provides the sufficient reason for the existence of the universe, really is what we understand to be God. God, as a necessary being, exists by the necessity of his own nature, and he's the ultimate cause and explanation for why the universe exists rather than doesn't exist. This is where we get the concept that God is eternal. He has no beginning and he has no end. This is a basic Christian teaching about God and his nature. So this brings us to somewhat of a conclusion to this part, and is really the logical foundation. By following the principle of sufficient reason and examining the nature of contingent beings that we've done throughout this and the universe, we logically arrive at the necessity of a necessary being, God. This step-by-step reasoning provides a rational foundation straight from Leibniz for the belief in God. And it supports the idea that the existence of the universe points to a transcendent cause, aka God. Take that to the bank, checkmate, atheist, blah, 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 blah. Important stuff. Don't get me wrong. I know I've said this ad nauseum in some way or another throughout this podcast. But anyway, I'd like to recap one more time. I want to bathe your mind in the understanding of this argument. So please bear with me. So to recap, 1, everything that exists must have a sufficient reason for its existence. 2, the universe is composed of contingent beings that depend on external causes. 3, the universe itself is contingent and requires a sufficient reason for its existence. 4, an infinite series of contingent beings cannot provide this sufficient reason, right? Because there's the paradox of infinity that we just finished debunking. This brings us to 5. Therefore, a necessary being must exist to explain the existence of a contingent universe. 6. This necessary being is what we understand as God. And really, this simple 6-step logical argument underscores the power and the importance of the principle of sufficient reason in Leibniz's cosmological argument, and really underlines how effective this argument is, and really shows its importance in Christian apologetics. And so now that we have a solid understanding of the principle of sufficient reason, I just want to delve into why Leibniz's cosmological argument is really so convincing and considered to be so convincing by many philosophers and theologians. So to start, let's consider the logical coherence. Like, this is a coherent argument. It is just so simple. The principle of sufficient reason is a foundational concept, really, in rational inquiry. And it really asserts that everything must have an explanation, and everything must have an explanation, which aligns with our natural inclination to seek reasons for the phenomena we observe. This principle is intuitive and underpins much of scientific and philosophical investigation. Science hinges on the idea that there must be a reason for the things that we see. Where did it come from? What is its origins? Biology, the origin of life. There's so much that's studied in biology. It's really built on the basis of the principle of sufficient reason. So Leibniz's argument is compelling because it methodically addresses the existence of the universe and does so in a scientifically accurate way, considering modern cosmology supports the facts surrounding his postulation that the universe is indeed contingent. Hello, Big Bang, universe had a beginning, so there must be a contingency to take place there, meaning it depends on something else for its existence. The Big Bang theory accurately reveals that the universe had a beginning point. And this part of his argument is a crucial point because it acknowledges that everything we see around us could, in theory, not exist. The fact that the universe does exist, despite its contingency, demands an explanation beyond the universe itself. Checkmate, atheist, once again. Next, let's discuss the necessity of a necessary being. Leibniz argues that the chain of contingent causes cannot go back infinitely, and I would agree. We saw that issue with the paradox of infinity in Hilbert's Hotel. Really, if it did, there would be no ultimate reason for the existence of anything. This infinite regress of contingent causes would mean that nothing could ever begin to exist, which is clearly not the case. We see that things do exist. Therefore, Leibniz concludes that there must be a necessary being, one whose existence is self-explanatory and does not depend on anything else. I love what Paul said in Romans 1. We know that God exists really because of the things that have been made. One reason why Leibniz's argument is convincing is its ability to explain the existence of the universe in a way that aligns with our observations and our experiences. We observe that everything within the universe seems to be contingent, relying on something else for its existence. Leibniz's argument extends this observation to the universe itself, suggesting that the universe's existence must also have an explanation. Furthermore, Leibniz's argument is not only logical, but also philosophically satisfying. At least I would say so, because it provides a coherent answer to one of the most profound questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? By positing the existence of a necessary being, Leibniz offers a complete and a sufficient explanation for the existence of the universe. And this is just so important. And this explanation does not rely on an infinite regress of causes, which is a paradox and an absurdity, which many find to be intellectually unsatisfying and problematic as a result. I mean, come on, we just went through that and the dangers of asserting infinity into this world that we live in. Leibniz's argument is also supported by its simplicity and profoundness. It distills the complex question of existence into a straightforward position. Everything that exists has an explanation, and the ultimate explanation for the universe is a necessary being, which we call God. This simplicity makes the argument accessible and powerful and resonating with our basic intuitions about causality and existence, and provides an answer for us that empirical science really can't, because empirical science cannot test a necessary being and therefore cannot test the origins of the universe itself. It can only make the assertion that the universe had a beginning. Lastly, I just want to say the argument is bolstered by its historical and philosophical roots. Leibniz, he builds on the ideas of Aristotle and other great thinkers, situating his argument within a rich tradition of philosophical inquiry. This historical continuity lends credibility and depth to his reasoning, showing that it is not an isolated or novel idea, but part of a long-standing philosophical dialogue, which just makes his argument so much better because it's built on the greats that came before him. So Leibniz's cosmological argument is convincing because it's logically coherent, scientifically relevant, aligns with our observations of the contingent nature of the universe, provides a philosophically satisfying explanation for existence, and is grounded in a rich tradition of philosophical thought. By positing a necessary being as the ultimate cause for the universe, Leibniz offers a compelling answer to one of humanity's most profound questions. This brings me to my next segment, really, and it's the scriptural and theological backing for his argument. And so, building on our discussion about why Leibniz's cosmological argument is convincing, let's explore how this argument is supported by Scripture. For those who hold the Bible as an authoritative source, understanding the biblical foundation of this can add significant weight to Leibniz's philosophical reasoning. First, let's revisit the basic premise of Leibniz's argument. Everything that exists must have an explanation for its existence, and ultimately this leads us to a necessary being, aka God. This idea is then echoed in several passages of Scripture. Much like with the Kalam cosmological argument, Genesis 1:1 states, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This verse establishes that the universe had a beginning and that its origin is actually attributed to God, and it aligns with the idea that the universe is contingent upon a necessary being. Another aligning passage from the previous podcast, this is another verse that was brought up in support of Kalam, is Colossians 1:16 through 17, which says, "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." So this passage here emphasizes that all of creation is contingent upon God, who is before all things and sustains all things. And this directly supports the notion that God is the necessary being who explains the existence of the universe. That is so important. Additionally, Hebrews 3:4 says this, "For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything." Now that is a direct verse that really underscores the idea that every creation has a cause or a reason, and ultimately God is the cause of everything. This verse mirrors directly the principle of sufficient reason by pointing to God as the ultimate builder, the necessary being behind all contingent existence. It's almost as if Leibniz had Hebrews 3:4 in his mind when he came up with that principle of sufficient reason. If we were to go to Psalm 90, verse 2, it also speaks to God's eternal nature. "Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." This verse itself really highlights the existence of God from eternity, reinforcing the concept from Scripture and from this argument of God as a necessary being who exists by the necessity of his own nature, and he's independent of anything else. Furthermore, Acts 17 verse 28 says this, "For in him we live and move and have our being." This passage from Paul's sermon at the Areopagus illustrates the dependence of all existence on God. It aligns with the cosmological argument by emphasizing that our existence and the existence of all things are grounded in God. Another significant passage, and I know I'm just rattling things off, we're almost done with these scripture verses, but another passage is Romans 11:36, which says, "For from him and through him and for him are all things." Again, this verse encapsulates the idea that everything originates from God, exists through his power, and ultimately exists for his purposes. It really beautifully encapsulates the principle of sufficient reason, attributing to the existence and purpose of everything to God. Really, amazing. Amazing how this all lines up. And then finally, I just want to share Revelation 4:11. It declares, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." This verse really just underscores the idea that all things were created by God's will and exist because of him. Again, this is pointing to God as the necessary being behind all contingent existence. And so, having explored the biblical scriptures that support Leibniz's cosmological argument, I would really like to delve into the theological backing for this argument. Theological insights provide really a deeper understanding of how this argument aligns with and is supported by Christian doctrine and thought. And so theology, in its quest to understand the nature of God and his relationship with the universe, provides a robust support for the principles underlying Leibniz's argument. One key theological concept that really supports this argument is the doctrine of ex nihilo, which means creation out of nothing. This was also talked about in the last podcast when I went over Kalam. And so this doctrine is really foundational to Christian theology, and it asserts that God created the universe from nothing by his will and his power. So this is really significant. So coming off of this doctrine of ex nihilo a little bit more, Hebrews 11:3 says, "By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible." And so this underscores that the universe did not emerge from pre-existing materials, but was brought into existence by God's command, aligning perfectly with the idea of a necessary being who is the source of all contingent existence. That's really why this argument is so important for the theological concept of ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. Then there's this idea of God as the necessary being. So our theological traditions really emphasize God's nature as a necessary being, and really I would say the necessary being. In classical theism, God is described as having aseity, which means he is self-existent. He created us, he created the universe, but he exists by the necessity of his own nature and doesn't need us. He doesn't need the universe. And so this concept is critical because it portrays God as the ultimate cause who does not require an external explanation for his existence. Instead, God exists by the necessity of his own nature, which is exactly what Leibniz argues in his cosmological framework. Really take a moment to consider Exodus 3:14, where God reveals himself to Moses as, "I am who I am." And if you know anything about that statement, this statement is really a declaration that signifies God's self-existence and eternal nature, affirming that God is not contingent upon anything else and exists necessarily. If you ever get time, really do a deep dive into that. I'm sure my lawyer friend David would really be harping on me right now. You should go deeper into that, but I don't have 5 hours to talk about that deep concept. So I encourage you, look deeper into the concept of I am who I am, because it really reveals specifically God is basically saying, I'm the one who exists because I must. I'm the self-existent one, is what he's saying. It then brings us to this theological concept of divine sustenance and providence. This is another theological point that supports Leibniz's argument. Theologians argue that God not only created the universe, but continually sustains and upholds it. Colossians 1:17, as mentioned earlier, states, "He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." This highlights the belief that God's sustaining power is essential for the continued existence of the universe, and it further supports the notion of God as a necessary being, because without him, how on earth does the universe stay together? Then there's this other topic of the nature of God in the universe, which is a huge theological reflection that we have in Christian theology, and theological reflections often focus on the attributes of God, such as his omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, which collectively support the idea that God is the ultimate cause and sustainer of everything. And that's important because these attributes, they highlight God's ability to create and sustain the universe, which is contingent upon him. So for example, if we were to take a look at Psalm 139 verses 7 through 10, it speaks to God's omnipresence and his intimate involvement with his creation. Here's what it says: "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast." These three verses emphasize God's continual presence and sustaining power, and they reinforce the idea that God is the necessary being upon whom all contingent beings rely. And that's you, that's me, that's everyone in this universe, every living creature, every object in this universe is contingent upon the might and power of the God that we serve. And that further supports Leibniz's cosmological argument as a great argument for the existence of God. And so as we reflect on the depth and coherence of Leibniz's cosmological argument, please let's remember that both reason and revelation point us towards the existence of a necessary being who we know to be God, who is the ultimate explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. Wow, that was a mouthful. This ended up being a lot longer than I expected, but I think it was worth it. And as we come to an end to today's podcast, I just want to recap that we've covered an amazing argument. And we've reflected on these profound implications that come from Leibniz's cosmological argument. We began by discussing the principle of sufficient reason, which is this cornerstone of Leibniz's argument that asserts that everything that exists must have a reason or a cause. And then we explored the compelling logic behind the principle and how it points to the necessity of a being whose existence is self-explanatory and not contingent upon anything else. A necessary being that Leibniz describes as God. And then we examined the biblical support for this argument. We drew from key scriptural passages, revealing God as the creator and sustainer of the universe. We went through verses from Genesis, Colossians, Hebrews, Psalms, Acts, Romans, and Revelation, and they provided a solid scriptural foundation, and this really illustrates how the Bible aligns with Leibniz's philosophical reasoning. And so further, we delved into the theological backing just now for the argument, and we discussed the doctrine of ex nihilo. This is key. That doctrine is key. I may do a longer podcast just on that doctrine. We also talked about the concept of God's aseity and the continuous divine sustenance and providence of God. Together, these philosophical, biblical, and theological perspectives form an amazing, powerful, robust, and compelling argument for the existence of God as the necessary being. Leibniz's cosmological argument, supported by reason, scripture, philosophy, theology, you name it, offers a profound answer to the question of why there is something rather than nothing, which was his goal in the first place. He wanted to find an answer for why is there something? Why do things exist? And so I hope this exploration has deepened your understanding, and I hope it has caused you to have an appreciation of Leibniz and really an appreciation for his argument. And I hope it causes you to pay attention to his argument and its significance in philosophy in Christian apologetics. As I close out this podcast, I encourage you to continue exploring these ideas further. Consider how they can enrich your own faith and understanding. Please don't rely on me to spoon feed you all the information. Fact check me, dig deeper. It's going to help you. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today at whatever time you're listening to this. If you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Facebook. I also have an Instagram page. Just search for Bold Apologia Podcast. Keep asking questions. Keep growing in your knowledge and faith. Goodbye, and God bless all of you richly.
Thank you for listening to the Bold Apologia Podcast. To find out more about Adam Parker's projects, writings, or guest podcast episodes, visit his website at www.boldapologia.com. There you can get more information regarding Adam's works, contact him to be a guest on your show, or leave him a comment for Q&A. Until next time, thank you and God bless.